During the 19th century, European countries took over big parts of Africa and Asia. They divided the continents amongst each other and made it their colonies. African and Asian kingdoms, empires or tribes had no say in this. Cultures were destroyed, rival tribes suddenly had to share a country, and people were enslaved. Why did the European powers do this? In order to find out, click on slide 2. As you might remember, the 19th century was a time of industrial revolution. Machines were invented, work was done in factories, and production skyrocketed. This fueled a hunger for raw materials, such as oil, coal, and rubber. Explorers discovered more and more of the inlands of Asia and Africa, and with it they found mines full of fossil fuels and other valuables, such as gold and diamonds. Let's go to slide 3. Well, because of this industrial revolution, the European countries also had a technological advantage. Native tribes fought bravely against the European forces, but their spears and bows were no match for machine guns and grenades. If you look at this painting, it shows a battle between the British soldiers and the Zulus in modern-day South Africa. Let's take a look at slide 4. Well, during the time of citizens and steam engines, between 1800 and 1900, many European nations conquered big parts of the world. We call this modern imperialism. And as you can see on the map, the British had a huge empire. It was the biggest the world had ever seen. Britain, France, and the Netherlands became big colonial powers, and for more than a century, the world was in their hands. So what reasons did they have for this? Let's click on the next slide. You can see that one of the reasons was nationalism. Countries felt that it was like a competition to see who could conquer most of the world, to be proud of your own country. The second reason is white superiority, racism. Westerns felt that the white men were given the task to bring civilization to other parts of the world. They called this the white man's burden. And the third reason was economical reasons. Raw materials, fossil fuels were taken from the colonies, and European products were sold there. So for example, they would take cotton from India. In the British factories, they would turn it into cloth or clothing, and then they would sell the clothing back to India. Let's go to slide 6. During this section, we're going to learn about a change in colonization. After World War II, many African and Asian countries wanted to become independent. They knew that the war had weakened the European countries, and they saw that Asian powers were able to defeat the Europeans. The Japanese had given them this example. So when colonies want their independence, we call it decolonization. Well, there are many countries to focus on, but I choose to start with Indonesia. Why? Because the Netherlands are involved. It tells us a little bit about our own history. How did our government respond to the Indonesian wishes for self-governance? Let's go to slide 7. Last year we learned that the Dutch have ruled the Indonesian islands for hundreds of years. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, made profit by selling spices. After they went bankrupt, the Dutch government took over. Plantations were founded, and the Dutch made a lot of money by selling the products. While the local farmers were forced to sell the products for a low price. They were half slaves of the Dutch. This changed during World War II, when the Japanese took over in 1942. Indonesian nationalists such as Sukarno saw the Japanese as liberators. The Japanese were just as bad as the Dutch, maybe even worse. The Indonesian Dutch citizens were captured and sent to prison camps, or they had to stay in camps or work as slaves on railroads through the jungle. We learned about this in chapter 3. Let's take a look at slide 11. The Japanese were defeated in 1945. Sukarno stepped up immediately, and he was the leader of Indonesian Nationalist Party. After World War II, he proclaimed that Indonesia was an independent country, and he became the first president. I don't think your Indonesian is very good, but this is the sound of the proclamation. Click on slide 12. The Dutch government didn't like it and responded by sending soldiers. It was called police action because the purpose was to create order in the empire. The Dutch felt that they needed their colony. Indonesië verloren, rampspoed geboren.
De toestand werd onhoudbaar en de noodzakelijkheid werd ingezien politioneel in te grijpen. Op 21 juli 1947 landden de mariniers op Passer Putti.
A terrible guerrilla war was fought. The rebels hid in the forest. There were many war crimes on both sides. Some Dutch soldiers burned villages and killed innocent people. The Indonesian rebels brutally cut down everybody who was against them. From the side of the Dutch government, I think it's very strange to consider that your country just came out of a war and now continued to oppress Indonesian people. So if you click on slide 14, you can see that both sides pictured the other as evil. The Dutch believed that the Indonesians were dangerous, bloodthirsty communists that attacked innocent women. And the Indonesians said that the Dutch were colonial oppressors, slave traders, and they attacked innocent Indonesian women. So this war lasted for years and there is much to tell about this, but we're going to click on slide 15. So how did this war end? You can see a representation of Indonesian government and Queen Juliana and Prime Minister Willem Drees. After years of fighting, the United States and the United Nations forced the Dutch to accept Indonesian independence. The transfer of sovereignty took place in 1949.
27 december 1949, een dag van ingrijpende betekenis in de geschiedenis van het Koninkrijk der Nederlanden. Op deze dag wordt in Amsterdam de soevereiniteit over Indonesië overgedragen. Na de voorlezing van de akte van bevestiging, die de nieuwe rechtsorde bekrachtigt, wordt deze akte eerst door Hare Majesteit de Koningin en daarna door de verantwoordelijke Nederlandse ministers ondertekend. Na deze verklaring plaatst Dr. Anders Hatta zijn handtekening onder de akte van overdracht.
Let's take a look at the map on slide 17. As you can see, the Dutch were not the only European country with colonies. The French, British, Portuguese and Belgians also had to deal with decolonization. Let's take a look at an important British colony, India. Well, the British had ruled India just as long as the Dutch had ruled Indonesia, and the British also didn't want to give up their colony. They broke down every demonstration against them. Protesters were arrested, or worse. It was a very special man who was able to change this. Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer who stood up for his fatherland. He preached non-violent resistance. His followers were not allowed to fight back, even though they were hid or abused by the British. When the news of brutal behavior of British soldiers leaked out to the world, Mahatma Gandhi got what he wanted. The British were seen as rude oppressors by more and more countries. Gandhi would also go on hunger strikes to get what he wanted, but he would never use violence. In this way, he was able to prevent a bloody war, and India got independent in 1947 in a relatively peaceful manner.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. Moi, je me considère comme un soldat, quand même, un soldat de la paix. I know the value of discipline and truth. Je sais très bien la valeur de la discipline et de la vérité. I must ask you to believe me when I say that I have never made a statement of this description, that the masses of India, if it became necessary, would resort to violence.
Gandhi never saw how India became a powerful democratic country that it is today. He was murdered by a Hindu fanatic in 1948. If we click on slide 22, we could also see that India became very chaotic in the first years after its independence, and it was eventually split into 3 countries: India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. There was a huge Muslim community in India, and they moved to a new country called Pakistan. And there is still a lot of rivalry between these countries. That's also the reason why Gandhi was killed, because he said we should have peace for everybody, Muslim or Hindu, and this Hindu fanatic killed him for this reason. Let's move to slide 22. The French also fought bloody wars in Vietnam and Algeria, but they also had to surrender their colonies eventually. They surrendered Vietnam in 1954. Morocco was lost to them in 1956, and they fought in Algeria until 1962. West African countries also became independent later. Especially in Africa, you can see the remains of French colonialism. Think about language, for example. On slide 23, you can see the last country that I want to take a look at, South Africa. South Africa was ruled by the Dutch and British for a long time. Afterwards, the white inhabitants ruled the country, and there was a lot of racism called apartheid. Black Africans were considered to be lesser people than whites. Nelson Mandela fought against apartheid and was sent to prison on Robben Island. After 27 years of prison sentence, he was released. And in 1994 he became president. He was able to do the impossible. He saved the country from a civil war by respecting both sides and bringing them together to talk. He is considered one of the best politicians the world had ever seen and an inspirational person, just like Gandhi.
I have fought very firmly against white domination. I have fought very firmly against black domination. I cherish the ideal of a new South Africa where all South Africans are equal.
Nelson Mandela passed away a few years ago, and sadly there is a lot of racism still in South Africa on both sides. Most of the money is still in hands of the white inhabitants, and hate and violence from blacks towards whites is growing. Well, these are a few countries that became independent after World War II. European countries brought industry, infrastructure, hospital, Christianity, culture and language to their colonies. They also were rude oppressors that used slavery, abuse and racism. The European countries made money over the backs of people in their colonies. There is still a lot of resentment in those countries. Not all African or Asians have a positive view of Europeans. And to be honest, even today some Western countries have very unjust laws against African or Asian countries. Let's hope that this will change in the future. Never forget that our history decided how people think today.